So I'm going to frame my work and stuff that I'm interested in relationship to this idea of speculation instead of kind of picking one theme, and then I think themes in my work are going to kind of come out through that. And so I like most of this presentation is just going to be me trying to describe speculation, which is like a really challenging thing to describe, and people have a personal relationship with it, and everyone approaches artwork speculatively in a different way. So I'm going to kind of try to talk about, compare it to literature and objects and systems of language, and talk about how I experience speculation and how that informs my work. So the first thing I'm doing here is I'm just comparing two definitions, which like provide a very vague understanding of what speculation might be. One is speculation as being the forming of a theory without firm evidence, and I'm underscoring firm evidence there because that's kind of like a contestable idea that you might struggle to kind of be able to define. And then the other is imagination. And the thing I underline there is external objects, because a big part of speculation is that although it's kind of this internal process, it's always in relationship to external things, other people's experiences, the people around you, common symbols, that sort of thing. And then one of these things I added right after Aiden finished. And then so the first thing is that this happens in this like a very specific relationship between language and an object, which I'm not going to describe. That'll become clear. And then the second thing is this kind of fits into what Aiden was talking about with the ambiguity of work. Another way that I would phrase it is not over-determining an object. Like objects kind of have their own information that people kind of have relationships to without kind of giving it an ethical or moral standpoint from the perspective of the artist. And by not determining that object through the context of your work, you can kind of create an open situation for the viewer to experience the art on their own. I'm just gonna, there's just two more slides of like just literature type of thing. This is a dialogue by Plato called Phaedrus that I really like and has affected my work a lot. And I won't get into kind of like the semantics of the narrative, but the analogy that's really stuck with me is Plato creating this binary of the soul. So he says, he has this metaphor of the soul is the natural union of a team of winged horses and their charioteer. So it's two horses and a charioteer. And one of the horses represents logos, and so human reason, and listens to the charioteer and responds to what the charioteer asks of it. And the other horse is pathos, which is this kind of pathological, raw and uncontrolled emotion. And that horse, when it sees beauty, it races as quickly as it can to that form of beauty, and the charioteer and the other horse have to do everything they can to keep the horse from moving forward. And in Greek society, the most beautiful thing is a very ripe 13-year-old boy. Plato was like that was a thing in Greek culture, but this book is like like Plato making a justification and then undoing his justification of having sex with 13-year-old boys out of like marital relations. But I'm kind of pulling it out of that context, and and I'm putting it into how it's kind of been used in philosophy and metaphysics in the last 200 years, which is this kind of spatial framework of experiencing something beautiful like a work of art, one from this internal kind of pathological standpoint where you're just experiencing something from your raw personal internal emotions, and then the other is from this external experience of seeing something logically in relationship to a common rationality, in relationship to language, in relationship to the artist's intention and all of that stuff. And so the way that I've thought about that is those two things are, that binary is creating, is a way of creating speculation. So I have an example of that here. The piece is a video called Apex by Arthur Jaffa, and it was just at the MoMA, if anybody saw it. And what the video is, it's like an 11-minute video set to like this like trancing kind of electronic music, and every 2 seconds an image changes, and it's a series of images that Arthur Jaffa has curated. So I'm quoting the MoMA curator that's describing the work, and I've kind of gone logos, pathos, and created that binary again. So the logos of the work is that, from Jaffa's perspective, the images are repositories of references and ideas that serve as reminders of the depth and beauty of Black life in America. And these are some of the examples of the images that are in the video. And then the pathos, or what I'm seeing as the pathos of the work, is that it's creating pairings and contrasts whereby heroes and villains, history and present, all become enmeshed in what Jaffa has termed spooky entanglements. So there's a super interesting thing that was going on for me while I was viewing this work of, the work, it's not all kind of esoteric characters. It's characters from popular imagery. A lot of them are Black, but some of them are white. Some of them are in Finding Nemo. Some of them are Jesus Christ. And pretty much every single one of them I have a relationship to. And so I'm doing this thing while I'm watching the video of kind of thinking about these characters and my relationship to the characters, kind of like catching the names of the characters quickly before the image goes from to the next image, and drawing my own connections, and then doubling that back with this idea of that Arthur Jaffa is constructing kind of the depth and the beauty of Black life in America, and constantly kind of checking my relationship to these images with this logos that's been pushed onto the images. And it's kind of, it's creating that speculative experience that I'm trying to describe of, at one point, giving me this internal pathological experience with images that is only coming from myself, and then on the other hand, giving me something that is external, that kind of positions me in relationship to other people in the world. So last literature page. Sorry for people in my advanced install classes, I did this page for another presentation, but the other piece of literature that is really helped me with this is a type of philosophy, like a new wave philosophy called speculative realism. I'm just gonna, it's like a pretty bullshit philosophy, but I'm gonna try to describe it. So realism, as in things that exist outside of our perception of them, which like seems like a really obvious idea, but like in philosophy, like things only exist inside of our perception of them. And then speculative, as in objects are unknowable, and in our perception of objects is constantly changing, and thus they have this infinite amount of meaning, whether we attribute meaning to them or not. And so this is what is called an object-oriented ontology, which basically just means like how humans exist. Humans exist in relationship to objects, and it's kind of leveling humans and objects, not putting humans above objects, and saying, objects have as much infinite capability for information as humans do. And it comes from this social context of the Anthropocene and giving material things value that, that even if we're not ascribing meaning to them. And then the internet, of course, and this endless proliferation of meanings and objects on the internet kind of being infinite and having infinite meaning. And this relates and kind of has influenced this whole wave of aesthetics and artists under this preface of, if a rock in the middle of the Mojave Desert is as infinite as Marcel Duchamp's fountain, then what is the role of art in creating a like philosophical or transcendental experience for the viewer? And the answer is, it sort of becomes like a pointless experience, or kind of everything is art, right? And everything kind of creates this transcendental experience, and it's just a matter of kind of calibrating whatever you're seeing in relationship to the infinite meaning that it holds. Which probably doesn't make that much sense, but this is my example of it. I think the giant squid is a really good example because up until like 10, 15 years ago, we like didn't like we knew absolutely nothing about the animal besides like thinking it was like a kraken essentially. So this picture on the left is a sculpture by an artist named Bunny Rogers, and she sort of had her own intentions for the work. There was a logos, there was its own thing. But when I saw the sculpture, I've never seen it in person, but when I saw an image of the sculpture for the first time, I had this crazy immediate snap kind of speculative experience with it where I was positioned back to 5th grade or 6th grade, whenever it was that a teacher described to me that, you know, there's this animal and it's 45 feet long as a child, but you know, we don't know where it lives and we don't know if it actually exists, because when I was in 6th grade, that was the case with the animal. And that that really kind of strange nostalgic feeling of, you know, fear and excitement, and it sort of turned out that that was a little bit of what Bunny Rogers was trying to accomplish with the symbol. But this idea that you know, this animal, in from my perspective, seeing it as an image, it's being viewed as an object. The fact that it evades human reason, it's creating this kind of pathological experience for me, which is informing, you know, how I exist, how things work for me, like in normal spaces, not just in the deep sea. And I'm so on this slide, I'm challenging that with this new scientific research that proves that cuttlefish and octopi and squid can dream. Because a big theme in my work is animals and speculating about animals. And I think the reason why that is because you can kind of have a speculative experience with an animal, but animals are also having speculative experiences, right? And we're painting objects, like kind of going back to object-oriented ontology, like we paint objects as not having agency, and that humans are giving agency to the objects by attributing meaning to them. But these objects, these animals, are creating meaning on their own and creating their own experiences. And that kind of is like an extra level of speculation for me. So now I'm going to talk about kind of personal work speculation stuff. So I was in London all of last year, and it's like really cheap to get out to the Highlands when you're in London. It's like $15 flights. So I went out there in the fall and had sort of this crazy doubled experience with it, like what you would, you know, like bullshit sublime kind of deal, of one, you know, being in this place that is naturally kind of insane and like so beautiful, and two, kind of my heritage as I have Scottish relatives, and that's where my family comes from originally, and kind of experiencing the mythology in that and whatnot. And then I did a little bit more digging, and I learned something kind of really interesting about this environment, which is that from 1750 to 1860, there were these things called the Highland Clearances, which was this massive expropriation of Gaelic peoples by the British government, removing them out of the Highlands for economic reasons and replacing them with sheep, because sheep were more economical and the Highlands doesn't have a good environment for growing anything, so replaced it with sheep. And it used to be a forested area, and the sheep come in, they chop down all the trees, the sheep are eating the grass, stopping any more trees from growing, and that's kind of perpetuating this experience of nature that's sold kind of and has developed this huge tourist tradition and experience for people, and it's sold as this experience of nature, when in reality, you know, kind of it's this false sense of nature that isn't actually natural. And thinking of sheep as an agent of this sublimation, as kind of human tools being used to perpetuate this, but they're also like, again, like sheep speculate, like they're like real living animals, and they're kind of, you know, experiencing this as well, not knowing that they're tools of this kind of human reconstruction of nature. So that rendered this project, which I'll call my first attempt at speculation, but isn't doing necessarily all the things that I would want it to do. Something that I won't talk a lot about in this presentation is how much bronze casting I've done. And that's why I went to London, because they had a foundry at Chelsea College of Arts, and this piece is bronze cast. It's wood, driftwood found in the Highlands, and then a sheep skull found in the Highlands, and thinking about these hybrid forms of nature, these artificial forms of nature in relationship to kind of the beauty of that experience. But the problem that you run into here is I found talking about it in crit, I found very quickly that, and it's a continuing problem, that it's the second I critique this place as being not nature, it's really hard for it to be experienced as also a beautiful place. And that's kind of this aspect of speculation where, yes, this is an artificial nature, but it's also creating this amazing kind of sensation for everybody that goes there, and this tourist economy and everything else. And I definitely did not get any of that across in this project, but it was kind of a first attempt. All right, now I'm going to talk about bees. So on the left is philosophy by Rudolf Steiner, who was a German teacher and philosopher in the early 20th century. And on the right is a sculpture by Joseph Beuys, who sat in on a lot of Rudolf Steiner's lectures, and it's cast in beeswax. And so Rudolf Steiner was writing about bees as a symbol for utopian forms of construction, and bees as a symbol for love and sex, and just absolutely ridiculous kind of different things. And that inspired Joseph Beuys, who was a symbolic artist, to use bee materials like beeswax to represent things like utopia and connectivity and kind of this hive mind and whatnot. And that's sort of to say that bees as animals have played this really fundamental role in human philosophy as symbols for utopia and symbols for a perfect society. And that's translated to architecture. But Vessel and Hudson Yards is a really good example of that. But this slide is sort of to explain that, the human production of space is killing bees, right? Like pesticides, that's like a tool used to control nature, and that's resulting in massive extinction of bees. And then at the same time, the bee construction of space is killing humans. I recently saw this news about a suicide at Hudson Yards, and this project, this recent tourist project called Vessel, has had a lot of problems to begin with, and this idea that there's sort of this symbolic utopian language that surrounds bees that results in this form of architecture is actually resulting in these kind of feudal architectural systems that aren't accomplishing anything in society and aren't actually moving architecture forward and that kind of idea. And that's what my beeswax walls are kind of about, or in reference to. On the left is the Da Vinci drawing of the Vitruvian Man. Vitruvius was a Roman architect who was talking about how the male body relates to architecture and the geometries of the male body. So this, as an extension, is how anthropomorphized bees are creating a certain type of architecture. Not bees, but anthropomorphized bees, which is to say that it's kind of this weird hybrid between bees and humans, but the architecture that it's creating is kind of fundamentally useless, right? Like, it's not protecting bees, and these Lego blocks cast in beeswax are not protecting bees in any sort of way, and they're kind of too small to make retaining walls for humans. So it's creating this kind of weird, pointless system developed from bee philosophies that aren't effectively kind of reconstituting space in any sort of way, but are just sort of there as symbols. So the last piece that I'm going to talk about are the vertiblocks that are outside. So these are industrial concrete blocks that are used to construct retaining walls in urban settings. And basically what happens is they are stacked on top of each other to redistribute land. So they're used on the sides of highways and in parks and that sort of thing. And so they're the kind of like concrete material brutalist backside of them is completely concealed. And then the front side of them is painted in a way that like really makes them look like stone, like in these kind of browns and these like stains that don't really run out or wash off. And so these blocks are having this doubled effect of one, redistributing space, so literally manipulating space and thus your experience of space, and two, kind of being perceived of as nature. You walk past them and you think that they're natural stone, when in reality, they're this artificial concrete that's being concealed as stone. And so really what the point is of this project is to just pull them out of that context enough that people can evaluate their relationship to these objects, because every single person in this class has a relationship with these objects. You walk past them, you drive past them on the way to school, but they go unnoticed, and I guess that's the function of a speculative ready-made, is just to insert something that otherwise kind of would go unnoticed, which kind of leads me to my weak conclusion, which is that speculation constructs relationships between the inside, so think of like pathos, the internal self, and the outside, so the collective memory, the nation, whatever, by presenting the viewer with unusual comparisons between things they can relate to, so things that they already have relationships with, even if they know it or not, and this allows them to form their own conclusions. And the effects of this, this is like a kind of a run-on sentence, but the effects of this are that your perception of objects and the material lives of objects, and like objects as in like animals, other people, whatever you're viewing as an object, is changing constantly. Yeah. That's it.
I was interested in sort of a comparison between your sheep project and the bee project, in terms of what you were saying with what you thought didn't really work with the Highlands project. And it made me think of a question of have you thought about or thought through what you see the role or place of critique in speculation to be? Because it read almost to me that the Highlands project got to this dead end because it almost started from a place of historical critique, and then from there produced a roadblock of what could be speculated upon, because all of a sudden you almost found the answer.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with this the Vitruvian bee, through this speculation of what architecture is for the anthropomorphized bee as the ideal, you form possible critiques.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I went over the bee, so that's an unanswered question, just in terms of I noticed yesterday while I was practicing this that the bee it isn't speculative, it's presenting a critique in the way that it's constructed, and I was trying to think of positives for with the sheep, there's a really obvious positive to this experience, which I expressed, which is this experience of nature and going out there and seeing this beautiful landscape. I still don't really know what the positive is of bee architecture. I haven't really figured that out, but I like what you said. I agree that that came from a speculative place and resulted in a critique, and that's kind of why I would still consider it speculation. And I also think that coming from it without the context will kind of create a speculative thing for the viewer without like necessarily the critique attached to it. So
But I feel like you're also making, you're taking these objects so out of context that it's like, you're making the speculation so vast as to where it could come from, like with those,
Yeah.
like cinder cement blocks, what are they called again?
vertiblocks.
Vertiblocks. I feel like you taking them out of context, it's not very many people have like seen them out of a context. If people were to see them out of that context, then they wouldn't have anything really, they wouldn't be able to connect that speculation to any solid idea. It wouldn't be able to ground them in any place. And I think there's this problem with getting so entrenched in theory that I've come to realize too, where it's like you get down this certain rabbit hole where people haven't been experiencing and reading about the things that you've been reading about and coming to these exciting conclusions and like realizing what you're realizing, they haven't been following that with you. And so as you're coming to these conclusions, everyone else hasn't gone on that journey, so it's like they can't quite get there. And I think with the information you gave us in your presentation, I feel like we were able to sort of follow you through that, but with the presentation of your work itself, I feel like we can't quite get there yet. And it's like I want to be able to get there. It's like I'm sort of I can feel this sort of questioning in me when I looked at some of your objects before, like maybe this is connected to this or that, but it's like I didn't have that solid thing pulling me into it. And I feel like for me personally, that's turned into like you almost laughing at the objects that you're making. And I'm not sure if that, like I really, really like that about your work because it seems like very satirical, but I don't know if it's meant to be satirical.
Yeah.
And that, I like that too.
Right.
You know, but.
Yeah, what I'll say about that is so in the first slide I kind of mentioned that speculation is a result of a relationship between language and objects. And like I'm pretty aware that without any kind of context, like any kind of language, right? Like nobody is gonna go and see this object and have the experience, like any level of the intended experience that I want them to have with it. But fortunately, I mean, the value of a museum context is that there is always language associated with it. There's a publication that in 2 sentences kind of describes enough that will kind of kick the viewer into, if they read it, into experiencing the objects in the way I want them to. But that sort of goes back to the Artha Jatha piece of, that's the direction of artwork that I have really fallen into and really have had these incredible relationships with in the last couple of years is always in relationship to language. Like it's never me going and seeing a work of art like a Jan Vo piece, which is just a pile of wood, right? And having this kind of extraordinary experience with it. It's seeing the pile of wood. It's thinking about what the fuck is this pile, why the fuck is this pile of wood here? And what is my relationship with piles of wood? And then reading, after the fact that, this pile of wood was donated to him by the son of the guy that like resulted in the U.S. being sent into the Vietnam War, which he's a refugee of, and that then again I return to the pile of wood, and it informs my work again. But I think that, I think that I'm aware of like how esoteric this type of information is, and that's something that I'm trying to fix.
Yeah,
or work on.
Because a lot of people don't have time to go through that whole process, and we won't soon enough either.
Yeah.
And so it's like, how do you make it not even approachable for people, but just like digestible in like I don't know, like not so that they get it when they see it, because of course that's not what you're going for, but like having just a little bit more of something.
Yeah, that's something I'm trying to negotiate, but that's like a really helpful thing to say. And
I think in response to that too, there is relief for, at least for me, in the fact that it seems like the thing that you're worried about people getting from the experience of the work and the thing that you are studying so heavily almost already happens as a way that we behave when we see something, like because it's a philosophy or because it's like you describing a logic of how we perceive objects. Not that everyone has the same experience, but I think there's something to be said for like people still will almost perform the thing that you are working through theoretically by just being there and seeing
Right,
it and
right.
then reading about it and digesting it. Like I think a good example, I forget the artist, but the squid.
Oh yeah, Bunny Rogers.
The Buddy Rogers squid is a good example of like a piece that probably is working within a framework that's very theoretical and probably very dense, but at face value still gave you an experience and can give people an experience of its very physical existence and what it represents symbolically. I still think that's valid, and I still think that's doing a lot,
Mm-hmm.
even if there's another layer that you're trying to work through of the theoretical bridging it
Yeah.
to a sort of deeper level,
Right.
if that makes sense. Like I still think that, and I do think that there's pieces you've done that first chunk happens to different levels of success, where like your video, for example, that you showed us the other day,
Yeah.
that I think did a really good job of combining the contextual with the piece itself of like, you know, it had your voiceover, it had like places for you to describe information, with
Mm-hmm.
also creating a sensory experience of, especially at the beginning of the video, being purely, you know, breaks and cuts in like sublime views of animated worlds. Like I think it performed both of those things really well, whereas maybe like, I mean, I know this isn't the final vision for this piece, but if it was just the vertiblock in the space,
Yeah.
that's doing a very different kind of lifting as an object
Right.
in relation to its context.
Right.
So like,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
This piece is, I'm like, there's going to be like a performance and other stuff that it's compared with, but that's, yeah, thank you, that makes sense.
When you're asking right at the end here about sort of the trying to find the positive part of the bee architecture, is that something that you're questioning in what the bees are doing themselves or for yourself in the work? Or both, maybe?
For myself in the work.
Okay. So I think there's like a relatable moment there for me, like back to the actual hive that bees live in that what they do so well is build community and sort of build a structure in a communal way. And I think when I look, like I'm just kind of developing this, so if it's a little rocky, bear with me. But I think when I look at the piece of the building block with the bee, there is that singularity that you're talking about, like that way you're talking about the individual being the individual, right? Like that is so apparent. And I think maybe it will be different in seeing them in proximity to one another and seeing them as a bigger sort of force. But I think like that notion of communal or community or building off of is important in both sort of the structure of the hive and how those things are built, and then maybe also in, and like looking at this piece too, right? It's this in its own right doesn't do anything. It's non-functional, right?
Mhm.
It's about the community, the building with of these things, the multiplicity, the multiplying. So there's something in that I'm not unpacking right now, but maybe interesting for you to think around, like this idea of the singular.
Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking like the Vitruvian man, you know, versus like the communal, like what else was going on to support all of that. So that's just one like weirdly not totally formed thought. And then the other thing I'm wondering if you can speak to a little bit, which to me feels so apparent in the work, and maybe it's too obvious and so you don't want to go there in a talk like this, but the relationship of the work to both construction and masculinity, and those two things that also work in tandem with one another, but could be picked apart and sort of looked at in their own ways. Could you speak to that a little bit, or is that something that you're thinking about, you have thought about, you're overthinking about? I'm wondering about your relationship to, and the work's relationship to those sort of ideas about construction, constructing. Maybe that ties into this idea of community too. And I'm thinking about like what you proposed for these projects too, like that's all about community as
Yeah.
well. So yeah, I don't know.
I mean, if I had shown any work that I'd done before a year ago, it would have been a lot more talking about masculinity. I got to SMFA and because my work up until that point was kind of like thoughtless painting, and I got to SMFA and then felt like my work had to mean something, and because there's such an identity driven focus here, I thought, oh, you know, I'm a white male, like I'm a masculine person, like why don't I talk about masculinity? Which is nobody cares, you know, it's like there are better things to make art about, I guess. And I think the way that I would answer that question now in context with my work is something that I've talked about with Jake and Aiden, which is that space is kind of inherently masculine. And I don't need to express that for every single person in the room to have experienced it and dealing with it constantly. And the manipulation of space, concrete, like these things are in a sense masculine in that they kind of constrict and negate everything that's their surrounding. And that idea in that idea with masculinity I'm still very interested in, but I've tried desperately to remove myself from the work as much as possible. Yeah.
I think going off of that a little bit and what Camille was saying too, like when you said the thing about the singular versus the communal, like I think I also wanted to make a distinction too, like I feel like, and maybe this is like a part of the gender like element to the work, I don't know. But there's also a difference between, I feel like between like all these verti blocks together, like they are multiples, but they are multiples of a singular. Like there's like this mold making like component in your work that feels like there's content embedded in that, in the way that it's not that each item, like each bee brick or whatever, is not inherently distinct in the way that they're not each one like crafted at the like from start to finish, but that you made a mold and then you're pouring the mold and making multiples in that way. And there might be like slight differences just in the way that mold making creates those, but like for the most part they are meant to look as a unison,
Yeah.
like come to a uniform full unit, as opposed to like indicating difference. And I wonder if like I'm struggling too, like it's not a fully formed thought either, but like in terms of this like discussion about masculinity and the constriction of space, I think that's not only in their function as like to delineate space or like protect something or establish space, but also just like in the fact that they're a uniform visual like presence, that like uniformity takes up space, and in that way like a billboard, like it like projects an aesthetic agenda of some sort.
Yeah.
That I'm interested in like terms of like if the motivation of your work is to speculate, and wondering to what extent also you're like speculating on aesthetics. You keep coming back to the language, but it feels much more abstract than that, like more like more broad, I guess maybe is a better word than abstract. So I'm wondering like, have you developed that like that focus of like what drives that like level of speculation, I guess if that's a question.
Well, so I had a slide about mold making in here, and I took it out, and that's something that I think about a lot. And if I had kept the slide, it probably would have had like a Matthew Barney stamp on it, who's an artist that I like and has influenced my work a lot. And just thinking about like whether I'm casting the work or it's precast, like the like artistic practice of casting is like it is what results in the construction of space, and like is like the products, like the plastic products that you own are all cast, like they all have parting lines, and that definitely is that like material process that I've spent a lot of time doing and thinking about definitely informs the work and relates to the work. But yeah, same. I have incomplete thought, and then so I was kind of lost at the end. The
Yeah,
tail
I
end
think
of
I
that.
am too a little bit. Like, like not with your work. I just mean like with where like I'm
Yeah.
ruminating on it or something. But I was just like, yeah, I guess maybe picking up on that distinction of like the singular and the communal and how those are working together, but also like that there is a uniformity to
Yeah.
the final product.
Yeah, I mean, pathos and logos is that's sort of to say like the individual and the collective, kind of, in another way.
I think you're also forgetting that you're working with a process that is very aligned with speculative. Yeah, I think mold making itself
Nice.
is going from one individual object to the process of deconstructing that object
Yeah,
into.
totally.
And I think honestly, I want to see it in your work because I'm seeing a lot of very, a lot of these objects look like molds. Honestly, they look like you're unpacking a mold. And I feel like, what if you deconstructed the construction of the mold itself? What would that even look like? I mean, what would that represent
Yeah.
if you weren't able to use the thing that was used to make the multiples?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it would be interesting. I don't know.
I'm gonna try and be succinct, but something that I think is a really cool comparison that you've made me make in this presentation is the contradiction of casting and mold making, and so the production of many versions of the same thing, with what you described as speculative realism, where there's sort of a flattening of all sort of objects into a flat level. So I think like there's something really interesting about like sort of like using production of things like casting and mold making to make multiples of something as a way, as a sort of supremacy over objects to show that they have no individuality by making a lot of them. You know what I mean? So like, I think that's a very interesting correlation of like a culture of individuality producing a commoditization that makes those objects seem to lose their individuality.
That's great. Yeah.
By being multiples.
But
Now we're getting into like a
I would question that though, because I feel like there's this whole. I would argue then though that like even through mold making and like the repetition and recreation of like multiples, like to assign like the same speculative possibility onto each one of those individual recreations, I don't think is what I think that's a disservice to these objects and like the idea that like this idea that like, oh, but like the sheep are also like their own things that speculate and that have like individual lives and like can all be these different things that like once all these like identical objects are like sent off into the world, they have their own lives and they have like their own like distinct associations and like distinct like futures that are built. And I like wouldn't say that that's necessarily like this like flattening of like creation of like a singular.
Do you feel the same way if all of those objects were produced like in a mold making situation and then they were constituted together to create like a wall? I mean, because I think that's like the distinction for me in this.
Yeah.
Like, because I agree with you. Like, I would definitely say that they have like, as soon as they go into their own lives, they have their own memories and uses.
Yeah.
But I think if they are built and meant to be like brought together and live together, they only have one singular life. Does that make sense?
like these.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, think about the life and the visual of the mold itself. They all have the same sort of look to them, but at the same time, they're varying shapes. But they're still flattened. And I think I don't know. I think that there's something that could connect so many things here if you were to just like look at the molds themselves and like, the splitting apart, the perfect line down the middle, or if it's multiple part mold. Like, I mean, it all looks the same though on the outside. It all looks the same. It's flattened. It's a box. It's containing something. And I think that's something that I feel like you're sort of approaching.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about making sculptural forms out of negatives,
Yes, definitely.
I
Definitely.
that's like a future project. Like it's
Like packaging material.
yeah, exactly. Like
Packages.
just showing boxes instead of art. Yeah, that's I've thought about that a lot, but haven't like worked it out yet. But also like that idea of like negative and positive space, which the mold kind of like articulates really well, is something that I'm really interested in. For example, like Joseph Boyce did a project where he pushed fat into like this back stadium area, like this negative space that wasn't being used in a like a university, and then like the fat casts are like removed and they're like negatives of this kind of like wasted space. That stuff is really interesting to me, but I haven't figured out a way to.
I mean, like casting, like real time, just like going out and casting things that should not be casted. I feel like. I don't
Rachel
know.
Whiteley.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. she did it too.
Also unformed thought, but I have a lot of sketchy notes. I wanna ask about the relationship between the vertiblock block and the B blocks.
Yeah.
And like you're saying that the vertiblock facade is natural. But I question how natural, because they don't look like a stone, like the stone cliffside, which they could look like. They're stone carved
Right.
blocks.
Right.
Versus the cartoon bee, which is very similar. Like it's a cartoon bee, it's not a bee.
Yeah. That so Kendall mentioned simulacra and simulation. Like that's actually a really interesting part about this form of nature, is that it's not it's simulating something. Like it's simulating a form of nature that preceded it, and it turns out that the type of nature that it's simulating is like rock walls that were already like reconstructed out of like original rocks. So it actually like it isn't simulating nature, it's simulating a simulation of nature. And like that idea, I mean, I didn't talk about it because I tried to explain it and it didn't make sense yesterday, but that idea is what the performance is sort of about, which is that like this experience of rock climbing is like a removal from nature in itself. Like it's like you climb on rocks to experience nature, and then you remove that to a climbing barn, and you're not even experiencing nature anymore. You're just climbing. You're just like doing an action that isn't perpetuating your experience of nature. And then you remove that one layer further, and you put the climbing holds onto those blocks, and then you're not even raising yourself up. You're just climbing around in circles on things that are a simulation of nature, and you just end up exactly where you started. And yeah, so to answer that, that's what I've been thinking about that. And then the vertiblocks and the bees relate to each other, but and like the two installations for the thesis are like antithetical in a lot of ways, but I don't really have a full answer for that.